Today I'm going to show you a technique called checkerboard lighting, and we are going to achieve this effect with just one light. Hey everybody, Lindsay Adler here, and I have been studying lighting and lighting of the masters for as long as I can remember. And so back in college, I remember studying photographers like Irving Penn and Richard Avedon and Albert Watson. And I wanted to figure out how they controlled and sculpted light, how they created drama and depth with their lighting. And one of the techniques that showed up over and over again, particularly by the photographer Irving Penn, is a technique called checkerboard lighting. Now fundamentally, checkerboard lighting is what you'd think of if you think of a checkerboard. Light, dark, shadow, highlight. You're doing that within the photograph. And so Irving Penn would do this by creating a highlight side of the face against the shadow of the background, and the shadow of the face against the highlight of the background. So black, white, black, white. And that's exactly what I want to show you how to do today. Now this technique doesn't have to be a one light technique. You can do it with any sort of modifier. It can be done with an umbrella, a softbox, a bare bulb. It can be done by stacking multiple lights. But I want to show you today how to achieve this with just a single strobe. Now, as I think of this technique, because I associate it with photographers like Irving Penn, I associate it with a vintage vibe. It doesn't need to be, but that's part of what informed the styling we have going on today. So I'm going to create something that's a high contrast black and white, something that's dramatic, and with that vintage inspired headpiece. The modifier that I have chosen for this shoot is something called a magnum reflector. This is a hard light modifier. Now fundamentally, it is like a large zoom reflector or a large silver dish. So it is a hard light modifier, but because it's larger and the finish in the inside gives a little bit more of a smoother appearance to the skin. It's a little bit more flattering. So you get the qualities of hard light, but it just looks a little bit better on your subject. And so the magnum reflector is also reminiscent of some of the modifiers that were used by the old masters when they were using constant and hot lights. But we're going to be using studio strobes today. So my main light is a Profoto D2 with that magnum reflector. Now to begin with, what I have to do is I have to create shadow. That's the idea. I need to have the highlight side of the face and the shadow side of the face. And so I need to make sure that my light is giving that sculpting. So I'm going to begin by creating a Rembrandt lighting pattern on the face. So I'm going to move that main light off to the side so that I have only just a little triangle of light under the opposite side of her face. Now, of course, you could also do this technique with split light, but the point is you need to have a nice defined shadow on at least one side of the subject's face. So let me begin by setting up that Rembrandt light. All right, so I positioned the subject in Rembrandt light, and let me take a shot and see what we're working with. All right, so you can see that we have that amazingly crisp Rembrandt shadow on the shadow side of her face. You got that little triangle of light. I love it. And you can also see we're starting to get a little bit of that checkerboard lighting feel. Because you can see on the left-hand side of the frame, the background, the top left-hand side is getting a little bit darker. And the reason it is because I feathered the light across the frame a little bit, so I've angled it away from the background, so it causes a little bit of shadow, and because a magnum reflector has a tighter, more focused area of light. But it's not quite what I'm going for. I really want there to be a stark difference between the highlight side of her face and the shadow of the background, the shadow side of her face and the highlight of the background. So what we're going to introduce is something to purposely cast a shadow behind my subject. For that reason, I'm going to grab something called a flag. All a flag is something that is used to block light. Now, I actually have something that is specifically a flag that you can buy, but you could use a piece of cardboard or something called cinefoil, which is basically black tin foil. You could use a V-flat. So it's anything to block light where you don't want it to go. Now, I've actually set up a flag here, and you can see that it's attached to my C-stand using a knuckle. So it is made for this, which is great because if you don't have an extra hand or you don't have a lot of space, it's still going to allow you to cast a shadow. You'll notice that the set that I'm using here, it's very compressed. You can do this in a tiny space without hardly any distance. You could even do it against a white wall, which is one of the reasons I like this setup so much. It creates a lot of depth and dimension without needing a lot of gear or a lot of space. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce the flag into the scene, and what I'm looking for is for it to cast a shadow on the background roughly down the middle of her head. When I move the flag into place, what I'm looking for is based on my camera angle when the shadow cast on the background is right down the middle of the head, which it is for me. But keep in mind, depending on if you move left and right, it's going to change your perspective. So let me show you what I'm seeing through my camera. All right, so now we are starting to get that checkerboard lighting feel. The left-hand side of the frame, we have a dark background against the highlight side of her face. Then on the right-hand side of the frame, we have shadows on her face, but a highlight on the background, so checkerboard lighting. But there are a couple things that you really need to keep in mind if you're trying to reproduce this look yourself. All right, so first of all, the color and tone of my background makes a difference. For this shot, I've selected a Savage Universal Super White Seamless paper. The reason this is important is when that main light spills onto the background, it actually has to pick up and reflect a little bit of that light. So if you're using a dark gray or a black background or a really dark textured canvas, it's going to be too dark. And so what'll happen is that right-hand side of the frame won't appear bright enough. And so that's why a light gray or a white is going to be the better choice, especially if you're trying to do this with just one light. Now, if you are working with a darker background and you would like to have the same effect, that's when you would need to probably introduce a second light, and that would be lighting the right-hand side of the frame. But again, this is definitely something you can achieve with just one light, but you have to have the right tone of background. The next consideration to have in mind is you need your main light to actually be spilling on that background. So what I mean by this is it's actually better to work in a little bit of a smaller space, have your subject close to the background, because if you are many feet away, it's going to hit your subject and it won't reach the background. So that's why I actually have the scene a little bit more compressed. And then finally, you need to consider the placement of your flag. If the flag is closer to the background, that line that it's casting, the shadow, is going to be more defined. If it's closer to the light and further from the background, it's going to be a little bit more subtle. It's going to be a little bit more diffused. Neither one is right or wrong, but know that your flag placement will make a difference. All right, so I have all the ingredients that I need to get that checkerboard lighting. And so I'm going to grab my Canon R5 and my Canon RF 24-105 lens, and I'm going to try most of my compositions horizontally. I really want to play around with that contrast. But of course, I can crop in tighter and get something that's a little bit more about the makeup and the edge of the hat as well. So got all those ingredients together, and now I need to get the shot. Okay, so here's what I'm going to have you do. Yeah, look straight at me, chin down just a little, beautiful, perfect. Example, I've shown you how to use checkerboard lighting with a fashion and beauty image, but this is also a fantastic image for portraiture. Anytime you want to create something that has contrast, depth, and sculpting, checkerboard lighting is one of my go-tos. So you should definitely try it out, and what's great is it can be achieved with just a single light. Now don't forget, even though in this lighting setup I used a magnum reflector and a flag, you can achieve this in many different ways. You can use a soft light source and then feather it away from the background so that it's casting a shadow on the background. You can use a magnum reflector, you could use a bare bulb, but there's so many different ways to achieve this. But it's all about paying very close attention to where the light and shadow is falling in your image. If you want to see the gear used in the making of these images, be sure to check out the links in the description below and visit Adorama.com. Now, by the way, if you want to learn more about how to achieve really sculpted, beautiful techniques with just a single light, I recommend you check out my course, One Light Artistry. In this class, I show you that when you understand the tools and techniques available to you to control light with just a single strobe, having a single strobe still gives you endless possibilities. Maybe you're not new to checkerboard lighting. Maybe you've tried this before. I would love for you to share some of your images in the comments below so people can get inspired and see there's so many different ways to use this technique. And by the way, I would love for you guys to show me some love. So like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.